During the divorce proceedings, a secret hidden for years comes to light when a boy reveals an unexpected paper to the judge. A dark truth that changes everything. The courtroom felt suffocating, almost like it was closing in on Dean with every passing moment. The lights above buzzed faintly, casting a harsh, white glow that made everything feel cold and distant. The walls seemed to press inward, their dull beige paint offering no comfort. The air smelled sterile, laced with the scent of paper, polished wood, and something that vaguely reminded him of the inside of an old library. The faint rustling of papers echoed in the silence, mingling with the soft shuffle of footsteps. But the most dominant sound? His own heartbeat, pounding louder and faster in his ears. Dean sat in the witness box, his hands gripping the edges of the stand as if it might somehow anchor him to this moment. His fingers were cold, but his heart felt like it was on fire. He was shaking, but he tried to hide it, tried to remain still. He couldn't let anyone see just how much this was hurting him. His parents' voices still rang in his mind, their heated arguments replaying over and over in his thoughts. The shouting, the slammed doors, the cold silence that had followed. He had never imagined that something like this would happen to them. Divorce. His parents, his mom and dad, who had always seemed like the solid, unshakable foundation of his world, were now standing on opposite sides of this courtroom, fighting over him like he was a piece of property. His mother was sitting on one side, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a tight, emotionless line. She didn't look at him. She barely looked at his father either. Dean could tell she was doing her best to keep her composure, but he knew her well enough to see through the cracks. He could see the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she clenched her hands in her lap. He could feel the sharpness in the air between them, even if she never said it aloud. His mother, always so full of control, was unraveling. His father, on the other hand, sat a little slouched, his eyes on the floor. The anger was still there, but it was quieter now, more hidden beneath layers of exhaustion. His father was a man who had always been strong, who had always been the one to protect him, to tell him everything would be okay. But now, Dean wasn't sure if that was true anymore. He could see the pain in his dad's eyes as he glanced over at Dean occasionally, but there was also something else there, guilt. Maybe even fear. Dean didn't know what to feel anymore. He had never thought he would be here, in this courtroom, about to be the one to decide who would get to keep him. How had it all come to this? He didn't know, but the weight of it all was starting to crush him. And worse, he had become the very thing they were fighting over. As the judge's voice cut through the room, calling everyone to attention, Dean felt a cold chill run through his veins. Mr. Stewart, the judge's voice was sharp, clinical, devoid of warmth. You've asked to present something before we proceed. Please, go ahead. Dean blinked, his mind rushing to catch up with the moment. He hadn't been ready for this. He hadn't expected to be put on the spot. But then he remembered. He remembered the folded paper tucked safely inside the pocket of his jacket, the one thing that could change everything. It had been hidden away for so long, tucked deep in the back of his closet, in a place no one would ever think to look. But today it needed to be seen. His chest tightened as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the paper with trembling hands. It wasn't much. Just a few scribbled words, a couple of sentences that had been enough to make him understand that everything was a lie. He didn't want to be doing this. He didn't want to tear his parents apart even more than they already were. But there was no turning back. This wasn't about choosing sides. This was about the truth. As he laid the crumpled paper on the table before the judge, the room seemed to hold its breath. He could feel his mother's eyes boring into him, the panic and disbelief starting to creep into her expression. She had never expected him to find it. How could he? He was just a kid. But he had found the truth. The secret that had been hidden from him for so long. And now, everyone would know. The judge picked up the paper, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Dean, then at his parents, his eyes narrowing as he read the words. "This is quite unexpected," the judge finally said, his voice laced with surprise. "Mrs. Stewart, Mr. Stewart, it seems that there are some inconsistencies in what we've been presented thus far." Dean didn't look at his mother. He couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze, not after everything. He wasn't angry at her anymore. He had been so angry for so long. But now, as he sat there, all he felt was exhaustion. A deep, aching weariness that went beyond the courtroom, beyond the divorce, beyond the brokenness that had come to define his life in the last few months. The judge continued, his tone steady. "We will need to investigate this further. Mrs. Stewart, you may want to explain these discrepancies before we proceed." Dean's heart pounded in his chest as the room fell into an eerie quiet. He could feel the tension rise, the room closing in on him again. His mother's face had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together as she turned her eyes away from the judge and onto the floor. His father didn't even look at her. Dean didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if his parents would ever look at each other the same way again. He didn't know if they would even care what was happening to him. But in this moment, for the first time in what felt like forever, he knew one thing for certain: the truth was finally out, and no matter what came next, it would never be hidden again. The judge's gavel echoed through the courtroom, signaling the brief recess. Dean felt like he was trapped in a time loop, as if the world was moving around him but he was stuck, frozen in place. His fingers were still numb from holding the paper, the secret he had kept hidden for so long. The weight of the truth was finally on the table, but now came the hardest part: waiting. The room emptied slowly, as if everyone was afraid to disturb the fragile silence. The gallery of spectators filed out, murmuring quietly to one another, some glancing back at Dean with sympathetic eyes, others staring at his parents, as if waiting for the inevitable drama to unfold. But Dean's mind was elsewhere, lost in the quiet hum of his thoughts. His mother had left the courtroom the moment the recess was called, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She hadn't even glanced in his direction. Dean wasn't sure if it was out of anger, or if she was just too ashamed to face him. He didn't know what to feel about that. Part of him wished she would look at him, say something, anything, that would make him feel like he wasn't so completely alone in this. But no words came. Only silence. His father remained in the courtroom, though he didn't look at Dean either. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the cloudy sky. The window, like everything else in the room, was cold and distant, and so was his father. Dean wanted to call out to him, to ask him why it had to be this way. But what was there to say? The walls between them had grown so thick, so impenetrable, that it felt like there was no way back. Dean stood up, his legs weak beneath him, and made his way to the small corner of the room where the judge had asked him to wait. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about a divorce anymore. This was about his future, about the life he would have after all of this. The life his parents had chosen to destroy. He glanced down at the paper in his hands again. The edges were torn, worn from being crumpled and hidden away. But its contents were still there, still the same as when he first found it. The words that had broken his heart, words that had shattered everything he had known. It wasn't just one thing, one simple mistake. It was a series of lies, of choices made behind closed doors, things he wasn't supposed to know. His mother had hidden so much from him, things he had never imagined. Affairs, secrets, lies about the family he had once trusted. But it wasn't just the secrets that hurt. It was the way his mother had acted like nothing was wrong, as if everything was fine, even after she had betrayed them. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about how she had abandoned him emotionally long before she had physically left. She had chosen someone else, over him, over their family. The sharp sound of footsteps brought him back to the present. The judge had returned, his expression still unreadable as he entered the room, followed by his parents. The air felt thick again, the tension like an electric current that pulsed through the room. The judge sat down, looking at Dean first before nodding for his parents to take their seats. His mother was still silent, her gaze fixed ahead. His father looked weary, as if the weight of the entire situation had finally broken him. Dean stood tall, his heart racing. The paper was still in his hands, but now it felt like an anchor, a heavy burden he wasn't sure he could carry much longer. But he had to. For the first time in a long time, he knew he had to stand up for himself. "Mr. Stewart," the judge said, his voice steady, "you've presented this paper. Now, I need you to explain to the court what this represents. Why is it important?" Dean's throat tightened, and he glanced at his parents before speaking. His father wouldn't look at him. His mother's face was unreadable, but her lips were slightly parted, like she wanted to say something but didn't know how. He cleared his throat. "This paper. It's a record. It's proof of what my mom has been hiding from me. From us," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "There's more to the story. Things I didn't know before." Dean paused, feeling the weight of their eyes on him, but he pushed through. He had to. "It's the truth. The things she's done. The lies she's told. The things she's kept from me." His mother's eyes flickered with a brief flash of panic. For a moment, she looked like she might stand up, shout, or even try to stop him, but she stayed seated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dean couldn't bring himself to look at her anymore. He had seen the way she had abandoned him emotionally before she even walked out the door. It wasn't just about her leaving, it was about how little she had cared. "Mrs. Stewart, is this true?" the judge asked, his voice suddenly sharp. His mother shifted in her seat, her face paling. "That's not," she paused, her words faltering. "Dean, The judge raised a hand, silencing her. "Answer the question, Mrs. Stewart. Are these claims true?" Dean's mother clenched her fists in her lap, her face turning red with the effort of holding back the rush of emotion that was clearly threatening to spill over. She didn't speak immediately, and for a long moment, the room held its breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and hesitant. "Some of it is exaggerated," she said quietly, her eyes not meeting Dean's. Dean's heart skipped a beat. She was lying. She was still trying to cover it up, to hide the truth. His throat felt tight, but he didn't back down. Not now. He had come too far. The judge let out a slow sigh, clearly dissatisfied. "We will need to investigate this further," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "But based on the evidence presented, I believe we are far from the end of this case." Dean stood still, his heart still racing, but for the first time, he felt a sliver of hope. The truth was out there now, and he had taken the first step toward healing. What happened next was unknown, but one thing was certain, his mother's walls were starting to crack. And for the first time, Dean felt like maybe, just maybe, he could have his own say in this story. But as the judge called for another recess, Dean couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger, something unexpected, was lurking just beneath the surface. The recess seemed endless. Dean sat in the corner of the courtroom, his back pressed against the cold, stone wall. The distant hum of murmurs outside the room was nothing compared to the storm of thoughts raging inside his head. He hadn't expected things to move this quickly, but now that they had, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what was coming next. The paper he had handed to the judge was still in his pocket, though its meaning had already shifted in the space between him and his parents. What had once been his secret, hidden away for his own protection, was now out in the open, and with it, everything seemed to be spiraling beyond his control. Dean stared down at his hands, which were still shaking from the adrenaline, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a 100-pound stone. His mother had gone silent after the judge's last statement, refusing to speak up or defend herself when the truth had been laid bare. His father hadn't said a word either, but Dean had seen the pain in his eyes, the same pain that Dean had seen in the mirror every day since the divorce had been announced. But there was something different now. The coldness in his father's face was fading. It was like a small crack had appeared in the impenetrable walls his father had built around himself. The door to the courtroom swung open with a soft squeak, snapping Dean out of his thoughts. He looked up to see the judge standing in the doorway, gesturing for everyone to return. The gravity of the situation hung thick in the air, and Dean could feel the tension in his stomach knotting tighter with each step he took back to the witness stand. His parents had already taken their seats again. His father, eyes narrowed and arms crossed, looked almost resigned, as if he were bracing for the storm that would follow. His mother was still tense, her face pale, her lips drawn tightly together in a line that Dean recognized all too well. She had always been able to hide her emotions behind that mask. But today, it wasn't enough. The judge cleared his throat as he resumed his position at the bench. "We've already established there are serious concerns with the evidence presented today," he began, his voice authoritative, yet calm. "And I must say, the implications of these findings are not minor. Mrs. Stewart, would you care to elaborate further on these discrepancies?" Dean's heart was in his throat. He had heard his mother's voice crack just a moment ago when she tried to brush away the accusations, but now, with the judge's words echoing in the room, there was no escaping it. His mother's perfect, controlled life was unraveling before her eyes, and Dean wasn't sure if she even realized the depths of what had been exposed. She turned her head to the side slightly, avoiding Dean's gaze, but her eyes were wide, and her hands trembled in her lap. She took a deep breath, opening her mouth, but no words came. It was his father who spoke up first. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath, though the words were loud enough for everyone to hear. He leaned forward, his voice louder now. "She's been lying to us, all of us. It's not just about that affair. It's everything she's done." Dean's heart skipped. For a brief moment, he saw his father's pain laid bare, the long years of disappointment and betrayal that had been growing like a shadow, now finally surfacing. But it was more than just the affair. Dean knew this wasn't the first time his father had felt abandoned. The way his mother had distanced herself, emotionally and physically, long before the divorce was something Dean had only begun to understand recently. His mother's face flushed a deep shade of red, but she refused to look at Dean. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You don't understand. None of you do." She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, drawing everyone's attention. "I did what I had to do to survive." Dean's stomach twisted at her words. The look in her eyes, desperation and guilt, told him everything. She hadn't just hurt him. She had hurt herself too, but in doing so, she had torn apart the family he had fought so hard to keep together. The judge interjected, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Survival, Mrs. Stewart? Or was it selfishness? What you've done here has consequences, not just for your marriage, but for your son." Dean flinched at the judge's words, but he didn't look away. His eyes burned with unshed tears, but he forced himself to stay strong. His mother's gaze finally met his, and for the briefest of moments, Dean saw something human in her. Regret? Fear? But whatever it was, it didn't last. She turned her face away again, hiding behind her carefully constructed mask. The judge's voice grew sharper. "Mr. Stewart, would you like to speak further on these matters?" Dean's father hesitated for a moment, the anger in his eyes barely contained. But when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost tired. "It's all been lies. All of it." He turned toward Dean now, his eyes softening just a little. "I thought I could protect you. I tried, Dean. But there are things I can't fix." Dean swallowed, his throat tight. He didn't know what to say. His father wasn't the same man he used to be. The person he had once looked up to, the strong protector, had been broken in ways that no one could see. And somehow, Dean had come to understand that it wasn't just his mother who had made mistakes. His father had his own share of failures, too. But those failures didn't make him any less human. They didn't take away the fact that Dean still loved him, even when it felt like everything was falling apart. The judge stood up, signaling that it was time to adjourn again. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," he said firmly, his gavel striking down with finality. "But I strongly advise that both parties take a step back and reflect on the impact of these actions." Dean watched as his mother and father filed out of the courtroom in opposite directions. He didn't move, rooted to the spot like a tree that had been knocked over, unable to get back on its feet. He was tired, so tired, of the lies, of the anger, of everything. But just before the door closed behind him, he noticed something that stopped him cold. A small, inconspicuous figure standing by the door. His mother had left the room a moment ago, but Dean realized someone else had stayed behind. Someone unexpected. It was his mother's lawyer. And she was holding something Dean recognized immediately. Another folded piece of paper. Dean's breath caught in his throat as he watched the lawyer standing silently by the door, holding a folded piece of paper, one that looked almost identical to the one he had handed to the judge just hours before. His mind raced. Why was the lawyer still here? What was going on? The lawyer's eyes flickered up from the paper as she noticed Dean staring at her. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a brief flash of something like surprise, or perhaps concern, in her gaze. She quickly straightened up, tucking the paper into her briefcase, but not before Dean saw the unmistakable smudge of ink on the edge. He didn't know what to make of it. What was going on? Why was his mother's lawyer still in the room with that paper? And why did it feel like something else, something deeper, was about to come to the surface? "Excuse me," Dean's voice trembled as he stood up, his legs suddenly feeling weak beneath him. He had to know what was happening. He had to know what his mother was hiding now. The lawyer didn't flinch at the sound of his voice. In fact, she seemed almost expectant, as though she had been waiting for him to ask the questions. "You shouldn't be here," she said in a low, quiet voice. "It's not time yet." Dean's mind was a storm of confusion. "What do you mean? Why are you holding that paper? What's going on?" The lawyer hesitated, glancing back at the closed door as though she expected someone to walk in at any moment. But when no one came, she sighed and approached Dean. "You're not supposed to know about this yet," she said. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "But since you've seen it, I suppose it's only fair you understand the whole truth." Dean's heart raced in his chest. He felt a cold sweat trickle down his back. "What truth? What is that paper? And why didn't my mom want me to see it?" The lawyer's eyes softened, as though she were weighing her next words carefully. "That paper," she trailed off for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "That paper is part of a much larger story, one that your mother doesn't want you to know." Dean's stomach twisted. "What do you mean? What story?" "Your mother," the lawyer said slowly, "has been hiding something from you. Something big. Something that changes everything." Dean didn't know how to process what he was hearing. His thoughts scrambled together like scattered puzzle pieces, each one refusing to fit into the next. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice rising in desperation. "What does this have to do with me?" The lawyer hesitated before stepping closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. Your father isn't the man you think he is, Dean. Dean's blood ran cold. His father, the one person he thought he could trust, was the subject of another secret? His mind whirled as he tried to make sense of it. What had she said? What did she mean? I don't understand, Dean said, his voice barely audible now. What are you talking about? The lawyer's gaze flickered to the paper again, which was still tucked inside her briefcase. Your father, she began, her voice shaky. He was involved in something. Something your mother discovered long before you did. And that paper, she paused, her voice trembling with uncertainty. That paper is the proof of it. The proof of the lies, the hidden debts. Your father, he's been hiding things from both of you. Dean's breath caught in his throat. Was this really happening? Had his whole life been built on lies, on both sides? He wanted to scream, to run out of the room, to escape the growing sense of betrayal crushing him. But he couldn't move. He stood frozen, caught in a web of secrets that were pulling tighter with each passing second. The lawyer stepped closer, her face softening. I'm sorry you have to hear it like this, Dean. But you deserve the truth. Your father, she stopped herself, glancing toward the door again. It's complicated. Your mother didn't want you to know yet, but now you're involved, and you deserve to know what's at stake. The divorce. It's just the beginning of something far bigger than you can imagine. Dean's mind raced, but the more he tried to piece it all together, the more tangled the puzzle became. His mother's affair, his father's lies, the hidden debts, was this all connected? And if so, how? He could feel the anger bubbling inside him, the helplessness threatening to break through. His family, the people who were supposed to protect him, had kept him in the dark for so long, building a wall around him with lies and secrets. Now, with every word the lawyer spoke, that wall was crumbling, and Dean wasn't sure what was real anymore. I don't know what to do with this, Dean whispered, his voice raw. I don't know what any of this means. The lawyer gave him a sympathetic look. It's not your burden to bear. But you need to know, Dean. You can't trust everything you've been told. This divorce, it's only the surface. There's so much more beneath it. Dean stood there, staring at the lawyer, his heart racing with confusion and disbelief. His whole world felt like it was slipping away, and he was standing on the edge, unsure of what would happen next. I need to see that paper, Dean said suddenly, his voice shaking but determined. I need to know what's in it. What it means. The lawyer hesitated, looking between Dean and the door. I can't give it to you. Not yet. But I promise you, soon enough, everything will make sense. But for now, you need to go home and think. Think about everything that's happened, and everything that's coming. Dean stood still, processing her words. Before he could respond, the lawyer turned and walked quickly to the door. Don't tell anyone what I've said. Not yet, she warned before slipping out into the hallway. Dean was left standing in the empty courtroom, his hands trembling. The world around him felt surreal, like he had just stepped into a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. What was this new secret? What had his mother been hiding? And most importantly, what would it mean for him and his future? His mind raced, but one thought kept circling in his head, the paper. He had to find out what it said. Dean walked slowly out of the courtroom, his legs feeling like lead. His mind was a swirl of confusion, his heart ached from the weight of everything he had learned in the past few hours. The lawyer's cryptic words echoed in his head, taunting him with unanswered questions. Your father isn't who you think he is. There's more to this divorce than you know. He couldn't shake the feeling that his whole life had been a carefully constructed lie, and now, the foundation was crumbling beneath him. He had to understand what that paper meant. He had to. The fact that it had been hidden from him, The fact that his mother and father were both so desperate to keep it from coming to light, it meant something huge, something that would change everything. Dean knew he couldn't confront his parents about it, not yet. Not until he understood what was truly at stake. But that meant finding the paper, the one the lawyer had hidden from him. He didn't trust the lawyer completely, he had to see it for himself. It was the only way to make sense of this twisted puzzle. As he walked down the hallway of the courthouse, his eyes darted to every corner. The weight of the secret felt suffocating. His footsteps echoed off the cold, sterile walls, and the noise made him realize how utterly alone he was in this. He thought about the times he had asked his mother and father what was wrong, when the arguments had become louder, when the silence between them had grown so heavy. They had always brushed him off, telling him everything would be okay. But now, with all the new revelations, he saw how hollow those words had been. The elevator dinged, and Dean stepped inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, he caught his reflection in the metal walls. His face looked so much older than his years. The innocence of childhood had been stripped away, replaced by something sharp, something painful. He had seen his parents fight, heard the whispered conversations when they thought he wasn't listening. But now, everything felt more real. There was a sense of finality to it all, and he wasn't sure how to cope. The ride down was brief, but it felt like an eternity. Dean had to make a choice, go home to the uncertainty of his parents' house, or confront them with what he knew. But he knew that confronting them without understanding the full scope of the situation would only make things worse. He needed answers. As the elevator doors slid open, Dean stepped into the bustling courthouse lobby. He was heading for the exit when he caught sight of a familiar figure, his father's lawyer, the man who had been fighting for custody of him ever since the divorce proceedings had begun. The lawyer was standing near the exit, speaking to another man, but when he saw Dean, his face froze. It was as if he was caught in a lie he wasn't ready to face. Dean's instincts kicked in. He couldn't let the opportunity slip by. He approached the lawyer slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. His father's lawyer had always been distant, never offering much comfort during the proceedings, but Dean knew he had to take the chance. "Excuse me," Dean said, his voice shaky but firm. The lawyer turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "What do you want, Dean?" the lawyer asked, his tone surprisingly cold. "This isn't the time for you to be here." "I need to know about the paper," Dean replied, his words coming out faster than he intended. "What's on it?" "My mother, she's been hiding things from me." "What is it?" The lawyer hesitated, clearly thrown off guard by the directness of Dean's question. For a long moment, he said nothing. Dean stood there, waiting, heart thumping in his chest. He didn't care if it was the right thing to do, or if he was overstepping. He had to know. Finally, the lawyer let out a heavy sigh. "Look, Dean," he began, lowering his voice. "It's not that simple. Your mother, she's been protecting you, protecting all of you from the truth. But now that you've seen what you've seen, it's only fair you understand everything." Dean's heart skipped. He wasn't ready for more cryptic answers. "Please. Just tell me what it is," he pressed. The lawyer shifted uncomfortably, looking around as if searching for an escape. "The paper, it's a financial document. Your father," he paused, glancing at Dean as if trying to gauge how much the boy could handle. "Your father has been hiding his debts for years. There's more to it than just financial trouble, though. There are other things, personal things, things your mother uncovered that no one ever intended for you to know. Things that will shake the foundation of everything you believed about your family." Dean felt his legs wobble beneath him. The air around him seemed to grow thicker, more suffocating. "What do you mean? What did she uncover?" He needed to know everything. The lawyer looked at Dean, his face filled with a mix of pity and regret. Your father wasn't just in debt. He was involved in something illegal. Something dangerous. And your mother, well, she found out. That's why things got so ugly between them. That's why she left. She couldn't live with the lies anymore. She didn't want you to be caught up in it. Dean's breath hitched. The pieces were starting to fit together. The long nights of fighting, the strange mood swings, the late-night phone calls he had overheard, everything now made a horrible kind of sense. His father wasn't just a man who had failed them. He was a man who had lived a double life, keeping secrets that were far darker than Dean had ever imagined. But the weight of this truth was heavy. Dean didn't know what to do with it. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to demand answers from everyone who had kept him in the dark for so long. But he knew better. What good would it do to confront them now? The damage had already been done. Where's the paper now? Dean asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer glanced around, his face tight with uncertainty. I can't give it to you, Dean. But I'll tell you this, you have the power to make a choice now. The truth is ugly, and it's going to hurt. But it's your decision what to do with it. Dean stood there, alone with the enormity of the revelation, the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. His world had just been shattered into pieces, and now, he had to decide whether he would pick them up or leave them scattered on the floor forever. And the truth? It was just the beginning. Dean's thoughts churned as he walked home, each step heavier than the last. The weight of the truth was unbearable, pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. His father's lies, his mother's secrets, the betrayal, the debts, it was all too much. He wanted to escape it, to pretend none of it had happened, but he knew he couldn't. Not anymore. He reached the front door of his house, the same door that had once been a symbol of comfort and safety. Now, it felt like a barrier, a wall between him and the truth he could no longer ignore. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, the familiar creak of the hinges echoing in the quiet evening air. Inside, his mother was sitting at the kitchen table, her face worn with exhaustion, her eyes tired but hopeful. She looked up as he entered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Dean, how was the meeting?" she asked, her voice soft. Dean swallowed, his throat dry. He couldn't hide the truth anymore. It was time. Time to confront her, to confront everything. His mother had kept him in the dark for so long, but now, with everything that had been revealed, he had to know what had really been going on. He had to face it, once and for all. "I saw the paper, Mom," Dean said quietly, his voice trembling but steady. "The one you've been hiding." Her smile faltered, her eyes widening slightly in surprise, then quickly softening as the realization set in. She didn't need to ask which paper he was talking about. She knew. "Dean," she whispered, her voice full of regret. "I didn't want you to see that. It's not your burden to carry." Dean's chest tightened, the words stinging like a slap across his face. "It's already my burden, Mom. It's been my burden all along. But now, I understand why everything's been falling apart. Why you've been so distant. Why the arguments got worse." He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "I know about Dad's debts. About the things he's been hiding. And about you." His mother lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as she clasped them together on the table. "I never wanted you to know about any of it, Dean. I was trying to protect you. From the mess your father created. From the lies that have been spinning for years." Dean's anger flared, but he fought to keep it in check. "Protect me? By keeping everything a secret? By making me think my dad was someone he wasn't?" His voice cracked with emotion. "You didn't protect me, Mom. You kept me in the dark, and now I feel like I don't even know who I am anymore." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. His mother's face crumpled as tears welled up in her eyes. "I never wanted this for you," she whispered. "I never wanted you to carry this pain. I just wanted to keep you safe." Dean stared at her, the anger inside him ebbing slowly as he saw the brokenness in her eyes. He wanted to hate her. He wanted to scream and blame her for everything that had gone wrong. But he couldn't. Not anymore. "Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" he asked quietly. "Why didn't you trust me enough to know the truth?" She wiped her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. "I thought I was protecting you from the hurt. But now I see, I was just hiding it from you, and from myself." She took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging under the weight of everything. "I'm sorry, Dean. I'm so sorry." Dean stood there for a long time, the silence between them thick with the unspoken words and emotions that had been festering for years. But as he looked at his mother, he realized something important. She was human. She had made mistakes, just like his father. And while the betrayal still stung, there was something else that had begun to grow inside him, a sense of clarity. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom," Dean said softly, his voice full of newfound resolve. "I can handle the truth. I need to handle it. But I'm not going to carry this burden alone." His mother looked up at him, her face a mix of relief and sorrow. "What are you saying, Dean?" "I'm saying," Dean said, his voice steady now, "that I forgive you. I forgive you for hiding the truth. And I forgive Dad, too. But I'm not going to live in the past anymore. I'm going to move forward." For the first time in what felt like forever, Dean felt a sense of peace settle over him. The weight of the truth no longer felt like a burden. It was just the reality he had to accept, and he was ready to face it. He wasn't going to let the lies and the betrayal define him. His mother reached out and pulled him into an embrace, her arms trembling as she held him tight. "Thank you, Dean. Thank you for understanding. I love you so much." Dean closed his eyes, resting his head against her shoulder. "I love you, too, Mom. But we can't go back. We can't undo everything that's happened. We can only move forward from here." And that's what they did. Slowly, painfully, but with determination. They rebuilt their relationship, piece by piece, learning to trust again, to communicate, and to face the future together. Dean never saw that paper again. His mother had burned it, and the financial debts were settled long before his father could drag them into further trouble. But the truth that had been hidden for so long lingered in the air, not as a weapon to tear them apart, but as the first step toward healing. In the end, Dean learned that it wasn't the lies that defined him, but the choices he made afterward. He chose forgiveness, chose self-love, and chose to move forward, no matter how much the past tried to hold him back. He knew now that the only way to truly live was to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be, and to take control of his own future. And his father? Well, his father would remain in the past, where his lies and debts could no longer reach Dean. Because Dean had chosen to rise above them all.